The Blues I'm Playing by Langston Hughes. 2. Then began one of the most interesting periods in Mrs. Ellsworth's whole experience in aiding the arts. The period of Osceola. For the Negro girl, as time went on, began to occupy a greater and greater place in Mrs. Ellsworth's interests, to take up more and more of her time, and to use up more and more of her money. Not that Osceola ever asked for money, but Mrs. Ellsworth herself seemed to keep thinking of so much more Osceola needed. At first, it was hard to get Osceola to need anything. Mrs. Ellsworth had the feeling that the girl mistrusted her generosity. And Osceola did, for she had never met anybody interested in pure art before. Just to be given things for art's sake seemed suspicious to Osceola. That first Tuesday, when the colored girl came back at Mrs. Ellsworth's request, she answered the white woman's questions with a why look in her eyes. "Don't think I'm being personal, dear," said Mrs. Ellsworth, "but I must know your background in order to help you. Now tell me." Osceola wondered why on earth the woman wanted to help her. However, since Mrs. Ellsworth seemed interested in her life's history, she brought it forth so as not to hinder the progress of the afternoon, for she wanted to get back to Harlem by 6 o'clock. Born in Mobile in 1903. Yes, ma'am, she was older than she looked. Papa had a band, that is, her stepfather, used to play for all the lodge turnouts, picnics, dances, barbecues. You could get the best roast pig in the world in Mobile. Her mother used to play the organ in church, and when the deacons bought a piano after the big revival, her mama played that too. Osceola played by ear for a long while until her mother taught her notes. Osceola played an organ also, and a cornet. My, said Mrs. Ellsworth. Yes, ma'am, said Osceola. She had played and practiced on lots of instruments in the South before her stepfather died. She always went to band rehearsals with him. "And where was your father, dear?" asked Mrs. Ellsworth. "My stepfather had the band," replied Osceola. Her mother left off playing in the church to go with him, traveling in Billy Cursand's minstrels. He had the biggest mouth in the world, Cursand's did, and used to let Osceola put both her hands in it at a time and stretch it. Well, she and her mama and step-papa settled down in Houston. Sometimes her parents had jobs and sometimes they didn't. Often they were hungry, but Osceola went to school and had a regular piano teacher, an old German woman who gave her what technique she had today. "A fine old teacher," said Osceola. "She used to teach me half the time for nothing, God bless her." "Yes," said Mrs. Ellsworth, "she gave you an excellent foundation." "Sure did, but my step-papa died, got cut, and after that Mama didn't have no more use for Houston, so we moved to St. Louis. Mama got a job playing for the movies in a Market Street theater, and I played for a church choir, and saved some money, and went to Wilberforce, studied piano there too, played for all the college dances, graduated, came to New York and heard Rachmaninoff and was crazy about him. Then Mama died, so I'm keeping the little flat myself. One room is rented out." "Is she nice?" asked Mrs. Ellsworth. "Your roomer?" "It's not a she," said Osceola. "He's a man. I hate woman roomers." "Oh," said Mrs. Ellsworth. "I should think all roomers would be trouble." "He's right nice," said Osceola. "Name's Pete Williams." "What does he do?" asked Mrs. Ellsworth. "A Pullman porter," replied Osceola. "But he's saving money to go to med school. He's a smart fellow." But it turned out later that he wasn't paying Osceola any rent. That afternoon, when Mrs. Ellsworth announced that she had made her an appointment with one of the best piano teachers in New York, the black girl seemed pleased. She recognized the name, but how, she wondered, would she find time for study, with her pupils and her choir and all? When Mrs. Ellsworth said that she would cover her entire living expenses, Osceola's eyes were full of that why look, as though she didn't believe it. "I have faith in your art, dear," said Mrs. Ellsworth at parting, but to prove it quickly, she sat down that very evening and sent Osceola the first monthly check, so that she would no longer have to take in pupils or drill choirs or play at house parties. And so Osceola would have faith in art too. That night Mrs. Ellsworth called up Ormond Hunter and told him what she had done. And she asked if Mr. Hunter's maid knew Osceola, and if she supposed that man rooming with her were anything to her, Ormond Hunter said that he would inquire. Before going to bed, Mrs. Ellsworth told her housekeeper to order a book called Nigger Heaven on the morrow, and also something else Brentano's had about Harlem. She made a mental note that she must go up there sometime, for she had never yet seen that dark section of New York, and now that she had a Negro protege, she really ought to know something about it. Mrs. Ellsworth couldn't recall ever having known a single Negro before in her whole life, and she found Osceola fascinating, and just as black as she herself was white. Mrs. Ellsworth began to think in bed about what gowns would look best on Osceola. Her protege would have to be well-dressed. She wondered, too, what sort of a place the girl lived in, and who that man was who lived with her. She began to think that really Osceola ought to have a place to herself. It didn't seem quite respectable. When she woke up in the morning, she called her car and went went by her dressmaker's. She asked the good woman what kind of colors looked well with black, not black fabrics, but black skin. "I have a little friend to fit out," she said. "A black friend?" said the dressmaker. "A black friend," said Mrs. Ellsworth. And we'll pause there.